This morning, we want to touch a few issues, and my task here this morning is basically a summary of CTUSAB's submission to the Advisory Council on Citizen Security. It relates to the issue of crime and violence in Barbados. And in recent months, the Congress of Trade Unions and Staff Associations of Barbados had made a submission to the National Advisory Council on Citizen Security. It is to be shared with the media that the submission was based on a body of extensive research. This organization is of the view that the effects of gun violence had awakened Barbadians from their frozen state of lethargy and apathy. The death and injury of young persons and the brazen way in which these acts were committed has started another debate on the unending slaughter of young Barbadians, and particularly men. CTUSAB, in its submission to the National Advisory Council on Citizen Security, viewed that the major challenge being experienced in the response to crime and violence in Barbados is the limited discussion there has been between stakeholders and on matters relating to the social ills. There seems to be some lethargic approach being adopted to engaging in honest, open dialogue between the citizenry, the law enforcement, officials, community practitioners, those of the juvenile corrections setting, our prisons, and other social agencies, teachers, social work agencies as well. And we also consider the youth and the community groups in Barbados, as well as the general public. CTUSAB contains that possession of illegal firearms create an avenue where criminal activity and violence have made the use of gun challenge to individual and public safety. Not many Barbadians are aware of the existence of the International Action Network on Small Arms, IANSA, or for that matter, the Caribbean Coalition for Development of Eradication of Armed Violence, which is the CDRAV. This coalition of non-governmental organizations has been at the center of the struggle against possession of illegal firearms within this region. The CDRAV has been on the job for over 25 years and often without the support of regional governments. CTUSAB has made a contention that guns are not manufactured in Barbados. So it left to ascertain the sources by which guns made their way into this country. There is the knowledge that both security and surveillance system at the Bridgetown Port and the Grantley Adams International Airport have been constantly upgraded. Yet questions are continually raised about the entry of illegal firearms into Barbados, a small island with several miles of which is accessible to private seagoing vehicles, an increase in private yachts entering the seaports, the unstuffing of containers away from surveillance areas, and with the construction of guns with high concentration on plastic. These have made detection and policing challenging exercises difficult. We want to say that at this point of concern, we, would be the anecdotal information which points to the high level of corruption and the presence of syndicates responses for the movement of both drugs and guns. There is a harsh secret that people deem as untouchable are the chief perpetrators of these crimes against humanity. Research conducted by Tamisha Howell, who is the senior statistician with the Criminal Justice Research and Planning Unit on firearm activity in Barbados, in 2021 revealed that gun-related homicides in Barbados fluctuated throughout the past 20 to 30 years. However, over the last 2 years, gun-related homicides had increased by over 40. As of the 31st of December 2024, the number of homicides reached 50. The country appears shell-shocked and unable to wrestle the issue to the ground. In the USA, not much success has been made with efforts to reduce gun violence, and since then any legislative controls which has fallen to the responsibility of several individual states. However, efforts have been made to expand control of the sale of guns, especially assault weapons. While the legislative action is vital, CTUSAB contains that to address the need for the access to guns become a more critical role if the role of guns in the prevalence of crime and violence is to be controlled. New legislation and strengthening of existing legislation will in turn have an impact on access. The traditional need has been that owning a gun was a means of protection to self and in some cases family and property. We believe that the individual right to own a gun should not be restricted to the state law enforcement and protection agencies, and that no individual should be granted a gun permit. Possession of guns should be restricted to the police and military agencies only. This may be an unpopular comment, but it is a measure worth considering as a first step to bring a halt to the ready access to guns. If we call for political will, but this can be achieved through the general public, it appears to support those politicians who pledge to make that action a priority in this country. While the exact data is not available, it is generally felt that less than 10% of all Barbadians own firearms. The assumption can be made that a number of firearms in the hands of people could increase as long as there is access to them. With the imposed ban on handguns, the need can also be reduced. Guns are not for protection, but for shooting. The situation in Barbados that while businessmen and women operating in shopping centers are likely to receive gun licenses, the snow cone vendor and the coconut vendor are unlikely to be granted licenses. It would appear that both groups are operating businesses. Those in the elite class and business groups are more likely to be granted a gun license. The availability of modern and technological savvy security and surveillance systems has reduced the threat of invasion of property. By removing guns from individuals, threats of injury, death through the use of firearms will be significantly reduced. It has been shown that where gun ownership is restricted, gun violence is less prevalent than where ownership is widespread. In the US, in Massachusetts, Hawaii, New York, and New Jersey, where gun control is strict, gun-related crimes and deaths are significantly lower than the states in like Texas, Iowa, and Iowa. CTUSAB calls for all sectors of government, private sector, civil society, faith-based organizations to unite in crafting and executing a comprehensive national strategy to combat crime. Crime affects us all, impacting businesses, workplaces, schools, and the family. We must now create a safer Barbados and a more peaceful society. CTUSAB stands ready to collaborate with all stakeholders to tackle this urgent issue and remains committed in doing so in its part for a betterment to our nation. The call for Barbados to show courage and become the first Caribbean country that places a ban on the ownership of firearms except for security services like the Barbados Police Service and the Barbados Defense Force, as well as those authorized security services within our country. Finally, CTUSAB welcomes the formation of the National Advisory Council on Citizen Security, and we stand ready to play an active role in any consultation, surveys, programs, projects, and any other initiative that can bring law and order to our society.
I can express a thought to coincide with what the President just addressed. We understand that the nature of this problem, which is very acute in the context of our society and largely an issue that is being seen across the Caribbean. But we in Barbados have to protect our own interests. And I am non-supportive of the expression that there's no need for policy to address this issue in Barbados. My understanding of a comment made regarding those who have the authority to act, that policy is not the answer. But I believe that policy would inform law, it would inform regulations, and if we are to make strides into addressing the problem, some of these suggestions put forward by CTUSAB would obviously have to be given effect to policy so that we can bring about some not only stringent forms of action, but also some legislative forms of action that will help to pull back, at least in the immediacy, what is really a major issue. Because if we don't put some ban, maybe call it a ban on toy guns, again, we were hearing toy guns ineffective, but then we were hearing that Customs had jumped up overnight and tried to seize some. But to what extent has that been a consistent policy? We don't know, because we still see people on the place with the same toy guns. Then we're hearing about they're coming in pieces and being assembled. Then we heard of the plastic component. When we were making the point, that was ignored. So if the idea is that we're going to sit down and wait to eternity to address a problem that is explosive, and we're only going to act when the nail is actually driven to the shoe and the foot of those who have power and influence, and they feel the pinch that then we will have an action. Then we are fooling our society. We are not doing justice to society. We must do something concrete, and if it means that it must be in the enforcement of policy to restrict gun use to only those persons who are authorized, as CTUSAB has put it, to those agencies, and of course those that are already license holders. I don't think you can just revoke them because they're not committed any crime, but to those who already have. But the rest, for the time being, put a hold. It may not be for eternity, but certainly is for a time that we have brought this matter under some measure of control. And I think that government needs to think seriously and just not only look at it in a cost-benefit way and believe that it's going to change because people's attitudes will change overnight. God forbid that happening, based on what we are seeing in the character of our young people who seem not to fear death, who don't fear anything, and they are going to act in an atmosphere of purity. And we are all not safe in this country until we take a decisive step. Hard as it may be, it's not about votes, it's about lives. And I think we must make that concrete step now, a decisive step now, in the interest of safeguarding the lives and the welfare of our Indians.
A licensed firearm holder might argue that they've gone through the checks and all the legal parameters which would allow them to get in, that they're not the ones who are responsible for the violence. How do you respond to that? I'm assuming.
But I just told you, I just said we understand, and then I said those who already have licensed firearm, well, they cannot. I would not suggest revoking them because those have, from the statistics, have done nothing wrong. So, but no newcomers. For the time being, for the next 5 years, if it needs to be, no newcomers. So we can arrest this problem and then see how we can plan going forward so that we have some controls in place. That is where we need to be at this time.
Right, so just to be clear, you're calling for a ban on civilians going forward to be holders of licensed firearms?
Not only, but we're going to ban the importation too. You see, you've got to start where it matters most. If we allow any and everybody to import a gun, you do not know where that gun is going to go. So if we say no importation of gun, then anybody from one will have to be answerable, and the law has to have teeth to deal with that. I'm saying that, we have said, the armed forces and those agencies that are given the authority to bear arms, carry firearms, police, the other security agencies, the defense force, fine, and those like gun holders who currently have guns, fine. Yeah. But we're saying, for the time being, put a halt on the importation of guns and see if we can quell what seems to be on the ground activity that has no face as it is. Because we can't seem to find out who the perpetrators are, but we can certainly be able to, if we say no importation of camouflage clothes in Barbados, they can't turn at the airport with camouflage clothes because they'll be confiscated. Agree? So therefore, same thing, we're saying apply any ban that is necessary and to give effect to ensuring that we control, at least we make an attempt to control the guns coming into the country. And if we do not give firearms by way of granting licenses, then there should be no new firearm holders who we cannot say, because we don't know whether a person is, who appear to be right might not be right. Because we seem not be able to trace a lot of things these days, but we cannot be punitive on those who have been granted firearms, who we have no reason to believe have done anything as outside the law. So those will be protected as it is now, but we don't want to introduce any new elements for the time being. I'm not saying it's a blanket thing, but we have to look to measure the progress of the situation and evaluate the situation, and at times the government can then move to amend the order as it seems fit.
Yes,
question.
Right, I know you've mentioned the ports of entry. I know that the government has would have announced plans over the years to use St. Peter, I guess that stretch as extra berthing berths, for larger boats and yachts and such like. Obviously to bring more activity to that segment. But obviously you mentioned that there seems to be a problem with the entries to the port in terms of security and surveillance and in terms of monitoring these vessels that are coming in. Have you been hearing, either Brent can answer or you could answer as well, have you been hearing enough from government in terms of the extra steps that they're putting in terms of monitoring, in terms of surveilling, in terms of making sure that these larger ships and boats are coming in, you know, when they do bring their products or whatever on board, on answer, or even their personnel, that they're being properly screened?
You know, in the absence of information, there leaves a certainty of doubt. All right, we have not ignored anything in what we would have said. I believe our research partners would have clearly indicated, you know, these areas as areas of concern, and that may probably need some strengthening. All right, we know that the Coast Guard and the Harbor Police that they're we know that the Coast Guard and the Harbor Police that they're out there doing what they're supposed to do. We do understand to some level that customs is present, and we would only hope that the measures that would be in place at the ports, let's say the harbor or at the airport, you know, are just as much in control as for other ports of entry. I also want to add, though I'm aware from the point that, you know, while it is that we do support the organization that government would have set up, the National Advisory Council on Citizens Security, that, you know, we believe that, and as Mr. DePisa would have said, you know, there's a need for policy. This is not just a table model exercise. This is something that calls for collaboration, not only for a selected set, but one that includes our country's persons who deal with community. It involves persons who deal with rehabilitation. It involves the families of Barbados also. And unless we get out there, you know, and apply what we would have read in a book, and apply what we would have discussed in a boardroom, and start hitting the ground running, these matters will continue. Because unless we go where the issues are and start to deal with the root problems, we are doing nothing in this country. And therefore we can understand why somebody might want to go and rent a gun. Why is it? You know, these are questions that we need to ask. What causes an individual to have a thirst for a weapon? These are the silent questions, the questions that nobody is willing to really go there, or even if they do know, are willing to say, because we live this and we see the problems. But then we hear, you know, there's no need for policy. I believe policy is the way to go. I do support, you know, what the GS would have said just now. Because unless we have that policy, there's no way, no real meaning or real way of control. You know, and we have a duty. Our duty, yes, as a Congress, is to protect workers. Therefore, we have a concern, not only workers, but the future of Barbados, because tourism is our business, you know, and therefore if it affects tourism, it affects workers in Barbados. And we have a duty to the future, you know, and that is where CTUSAB stands in its position.
Hey, listen up, listen up, listen up. National Trade Unit Center, working for the good of all. National Trade Unit Center, go where you know we got control. We working with